Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Ding and the quiz is done. First things first, pause the video, do the do now quiz. Okay, so today we are going to be doing an interpretations question, a convincing question, and we're going to be looking at the Domesday book, which is something that I've been referencing and alluding to over the last few weeks. And we're going to do quite a substantial reading on it. Now you'll notice if you have a look at the sheet for today that it is fairly long. It's 3 sides. Now a lot of the reason why it is longer is because you'll see that I've shifted everything to the right a little bit, and I'm going to explain why I've done that in a second. So, in fact, let's just do it now. Switch to the visualizer. Okay, so basically this is a fairly tricky reading. This comes from a magazine that I read, BBC History magazine, funnily enough. And I haven't adapted it hugely. Now, as a result of that being quite a tricky text and being a slightly longer text, I thought it would be better for us to break it down. So you've got a series of questions along the side which roughly line up with the section that you're reading. So we're going to read the section, we're going to answer the questions, and then we'll move on. And the aim of this is just to sort of break it down a little bit more and make it easier for you to follow the text. If you can print, please do. If you can't, then just answer the questions in your book. That's absolutely fine. Okay, so this first section is what the Domesday book actually is. Then we'll start looking at why the Domesday book was commissioned and the effects of it. So words that are going to come up today: a hide is a unit of land, so a way in which land was measured. An inquest is an investigation into something. It's usually an official investigation into something. A vassal is someone who holds land from someone else in the feudal system. To pay homage to someone is to pay respect to someone, and to legitimise something is to make something look justified or right. Okay. In 1085, William the Conqueror faced the greatest crisis of his life and reign. This came 20 years after his famous invasion and conquest of 1066. In the 1080s, William's position as king had begun to look vulnerable. His eldest son Robert was in rebellion and gathering support in northern France for an attack on Normandy, and the King of Denmark was preparing to invade England. William's response was characteristically vigorous. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he mobilised the largest force of mounted men and infantry ever seen in England, forced his vassals to supply the army in each proportion to his land, and scorched the coastline to prevent his enemies from gaining a foothold, the kind of foothold that his own army had found in 1066. The atmosphere of England in 1085 must have resembled 1940, with Hitler's forces poised for invasion. Then, at Christmas, the king called his advisers to a council at Gloucester. There he had deep thought and very deep discussion with his council about this country, how it was occupied, or with what sort of people. He then sent his men all over England into every shire to conduct a survey. So very narrowly did he have it investigated that there was no single hide of land, nor indeed one ox, nor one cow, nor one pig, which was there left out. And all these records were brought to him afterwards. Faced with the prospect of political and military catastrophe, the Conqueror, one of the greatest military commanders of the 11th century, unleashed a ginormous fact-finding exercise. Why? How did he imagine that a book would help him resist a Viking invasion? So, essentially, this section explains what the Domesday book is. But before we get into that, I want you to answer these 2 questions. Why was England in crisis in 1085? And how did William respond to the threats in 1086? And there are 3 different things that I want you to note down for this section here. So pause the video and then answer those questions. Right. So, the answers I've given them, and I suppose I should probably put 2 there. William was facing a rebellion in Normandy from his eldest son Robert, and he was facing an invasion. There we go, an invasion from the King of Denmark. So a rebellion within Normandy, an invasion from Denmark. How did he respond to it? Number one, he organised an army to fight an invasion. The word that may have thrown you there is to mobilise. You probably would have looked at this when you looked at World War One. You looked at Russia mobilising its army in 6 weeks. To mobilise an army basically just means to organise them, get them ready to fight. He destroyed property around the coastline, and he organised a survey of England. And the rest of this article is basically trying to explain, well, why would organising a survey of England help with this crisis? And just quickly, let's put this back. Check and correct your answers. What I've got, you need to have. Right, let's crack on. The key to understanding why it was produced is establishing how it was made. The kingdom was divided into 7 circuits, most with 5 shires. Commissioners were appointed to conduct the survey in each circuit. They were given a checklist of questions to answer for every parcel of property. Who held it in 1066? Who holds it now? How many people live there? How much livestock, woodland and meadow has it? What is its tax rating? How much money does it generate? Every landholder was then called to give evidence at their local shire courts to provide evidence for their claims. Thousands of claims were challenged, and not even the most powerful lords were immune. So not even the most powerful lords were protected from being challenged for their claims to land. For example, Pico, the Norman sheriff of Cambridgeshire, suffered a difficult time at his shire court. The monks of Ely described him as a hungry lion, a prowling wolf, a crafty fox, a filthy pig, a shameless dog. And to judge from the number of challenges to his title registered in the Domesday Book, people said as much at the Shire Court. So when the monks at Ely were talking about all of these insults, they're basically implying the fact that he essentially stole land from people. And when he was at this Shire Court trying to defend his claim, people challenged it, which demonstrates that the monks at Ely were correct. Alright, I now just turned the page, but we now need to go back. How was the Domesday Survey carried out? There are 3 steps to this process. So pause the video, answer the question in the box. Okay, let's see what I made earlier. So, step 1, commissioners travelled around their circuits asking questions. So people would say, well, I own this amount of land, it's worth this amount, it has this many cows on it, etc. Landholders went to shire courts to prove their claims, so what they'd said here, they then had to prove at court, and then the results were written up into the Domesday Book. So this step here is designed to make sure that this record is as accurate as possible. Yeah, and of course I'd missed the final paragraph. Oh well. The results of all these inquests across England were eventually written into a single document which is now known as Great Domesday Book. However, it is possible that news of William's death on the 9th of September 1087 brought the work of writing up the survey to an abrupt end. It's important to note that there are some areas of England that weren't included in the survey. I believe that London wasn't included, and a lot of people think that it wasn't included because William died and so the survey stopped being done. Okay. What was the purpose of the survey? This remains deeply controversial. Many historians have argued that it was all about land tax, known as the Geld. That is logical. William desperately needed cash to finance his wars. Tax records from William's reign reveal that many landholders enjoyed tax breaks and loopholes, so ways to get out of paying tax. So there was a pressing need to make tax collection more efficient. The survey's terms of reference support these theories. Commissioners were instructed to establish the tax which could be made from every parcel of land in England, and to collect further information that which would enable them to establish if it could pay more. Every entry in the Domesday Book supplies that information. The problem is that its layout makes it spectacularly makes it a spectacularly unhelpful guide for taxation. To collect the land tax efficiently, royal officials needed information arranged in geographical order, hundred by hundred and village by village, so they would know exactly where to go and how much to collect. But Domesday's main organising principle is personal, not geographical. It's organised according to the person, not the area. Each shire begins with a numbered list, starting with the king and then listing the names of the tenants-in-chief, lords who held land directly from the king. The holdings of the king and tenants-in-chief are then listed in the same order under numbered headings in the pages that follow. Any tax official trying to use this information laid out this way would have quickly lost the will to live. Imagine a situation where, rather than everybody's timetable being organised by their class, it was organised by their birthday. So it just had like name, birthday, lesson, room. And if I was in a free and I was trying to find out where one of you was, and I had to use that to try and figure it out, I would very, very quickly become annoyed. Right, so using this section, answer these questions. Okay, so some historians argue that the purpose of the Domesday Book was to determine how many taxes people should be paying to the king. And this does link up with the crisis that we saw at the beginning of the reading, because as we've spoken about before, if you want to fight a war, you need money. You need money to pay troops, whether they're mercenaries or troops within your country. No money, no army. What's the problem with this theory? The survey is organised by person rather than by land, which would make it extremely difficult to determine how much land was worth in terms of taxes. This bit is really important. It's not enough just to say, well, it was organised by person rather than by land. You need to explain to me why that was a problem. Okay. The structure of the Domesday Book does, however, make it an extraordinarily effective instrument of political control. Its table of contents and numbered headings imply that all land was held either directly by the king or from him by tenants-in-chief. It therefore secured a political principle that lay at the heart of the conqueror's regime, that the king claimed to be the source of all land ownership. Armed with the Domesday Book, King William could threaten to dispossess a disobedient baron in a matter of minutes. It is not hard to see how that would have brought comfort to a king who needed loyalty from the major landowners more than ever. This links really closely to what we were looking at with land ownership last lesson, or a few lessons ago, when we talked about the relationship between landlord and tenant being really strong. Okay. This form of political control was also potentially very profitable, for the king could also use his position to generate new streams of income. For example, if a baron died, the king could demand the payment of a relief, a kind of death tax, paid by an heir to enter into their inheritance. These forms of income are known to historians as feudal incidents. Later texts demonstrate that William's son, Kings William II and Henry I, generated enormous sums of money for them. Or from them, sorry. Okay. Pause the video, answer that question. Now, I would argue that this is another one that I should probably put down a 2 for, because you do have 2 benefits here. First of all, reinforce the principle that the kings owed all land in England. That allowed him to take away land from disobedient lords. We can talk about this idea of punishment. Knowing who held land and owning it allowed kings to generate extra income through feudal incidents. Make sure you use that term, feudal incident. If you use that accurately in an exam, that's a very good demonstration of the depth of your knowledge. Why did the barons agree to it? The Domesday Survey was completed with astonishing speed within 6 months of the Gloucester Council. This could not have been achieved without the active cooperation of the barons. So what was in it for them? Something that they had longed for throughout the long period during which England had been conquered was the... Let's try again. Something that they had longed for throughout the long period during which England had been conquered was security of title to their land. Domesday served to make questionable claims to land unassailable. And unassailable just means you can't argue against it, you can't challenge it. In other words, the Domesday Survey was a hard-nosed deal between the king and his barons. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, on the 1st of August 1086, his councillors came to him, King William, and all the people occupying land who were of any account all over England, no matter whose vassal they may be, and they all submitted to him and became his vassals and swore oaths of allegiance. This extraordinary event was most likely the climax to the Domesday Survey. Those records strengthened William's tax base and made clear that he was the source of all land in England with astonishing precision, but they also constituted unchallengeable evidence of the barons' title to property. That was enough to persuade them to swear allegiance and pay homage to the king. They did so in return for the land that William had granted them, with those rights now written in the greatest charter of confirmation ever made in the medieval world. Okay, this section, those two questions. Pause the video and answer them. Okay, let's have a look. And I need to do this in a way that doesn't reveal the next activity. Okay, this is a fairly tricky point, so I am going to go through it. Why were many Norman lords concerned about their land? They didn't have clear evidence that they should hold the land they did. Now, what I would normally do, if this was a lesson, is... Oh God, I'm trying to think about who sits on the front row. It has been so long since I've been in my classroom. Right, Emily, I'm going to pick on you because you sit on the front row. If this was normally one of my lessons, I would walk up to you and I would steal your pencil case. And I would say, well, this is mine now. And I'm sure as soon as I said that, you would go, no, it isn't. It's mine. Which my response would be, prove it. And unfortunately for Emily, it is highly unlikely that Emily has her name written all over her pencil case. It's also highly unlikely that Emily has the receipt that proves that she purchased that pencil case and that it is hers. As a result of that, it kind of comes down to one person's word against the other. And obviously this is a alternate universe in which I am incredibly dishonest and I am willing to steal. In this alternate universe, who are you going to go up against? A fellow student or somebody who has the ability to send you to reflection? You are probably going to side with the strongest person in the room for fear of consequences for yourself. And this is essentially what happened after 1066. Many Normans simply stole land, or claimed that land had become theirs, that was over multiple people's estates. And they never had anything official that said that they owned it. And that meant that after the conquest, even though these lords were working that land and were accepting rent from people who worked that land, etc., 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 they never officially owned it, or they didn't have a piece of paper that officially said that they owned it. And the Domesday Book just served as a record of who owned what. And so it was a really, really good way for Norman lords who had essentially stolen land to legitimise their ownership of that land and to secure their ownership of their land. And for many Norman lords, this is exactly what they wanted. So it answers both questions, doesn't it? So on the one hand, the problem was they didn't have clear evidence that they owned the land, and they wanted to have it. And so they agreed to the Domesday Book because they got protection from their land from other people. And when we say protection here, I'm not talking about like physical protection in case of attack. I'm talking about protection from other people trying to claim it's theirs. And in return, they had to agree that all land was owned by the king and that they were one of the king's men. So it's a bit of a balancing act. Okay. So if we go back right to the beginning of this article, when it talks about this crisis and why organising a survey of England might have helped with this crisis. You could argue that it solves the crisis because it allowed William to organise a lot more tax, or there's a lot of problems with that theory. You could argue that it was about gaining loyalty from his men and extra income through things like feudal incidents, which meant that A, the men would be more willing to fight for him, and B, he could gain money that he could use to hire people like mercenaries. And I can't remember whether I was doing 1, 2, or 3, or A, B, or C, but C, it also meant from a different route that the barons were much more loyal to William because he'd done them a huge service, he had secured their title to their land, and they therefore had agreed to fight for him. So it's about, could arguably be about tax, but it's a bit shaky. It's most likely about gaining funds for himself through feudal incidents and gaining the support and loyalty of the barons. Okay, so we are going to have a look at an interpretation, and we're going to look at how convincing that interpretation is, and it's been a while, so let's just remind ourselves that when we're looking at a convincing question, we are comparing the interpretation to our own knowledge. Now, when we do that, we're not just going to say, but there are questions about it, or what about this, and what about this? It's the own knowledge bit which is incredibly important. You could pretty much take any text and just say, haha, but what about this? And is this true? And have you got any proof for this? But unless you can actually compare it to something factual, you're not doing anything other than picking holes in it. So, let's have a look at the interpretation, which is a whole 3/4 of a line. And oh, what a surprise, it's from Mark Morris. Right. But if the barons gained much from the bargain, the king gained more. Now, the reason why I have very, very deliberately given you a short interpretation is to try and move away from this approach where we focus on single words in isolation and move towards an approach where we look at the whole argument. And that's obviously easier to do with a shorter interpretation. So what we need to do now is determine what the main argument of this interpretation is. So I want you to pause the video and then just annotate the interpretation with what you think Mark Morris is actually trying to say about the Domesday Book. Okay, so there are a couple of things that we can say here. We can first of all say both benefited. Because he's saying barons gain some, king gain more, right? But then he's saying that. So my first point is that they both benefited from the Domesday Book. My second point is that the king hugely gained. More than barons. And in fact, we can talk about like the king gaining power over the barons. So those are the key points that I would discuss, and then you would need to pick out the evidence that we have that either supports or refutes Morris's arguments. And to do that, we would go through the text, through the answers that we've got here, and use that to establish our chains of reasoning. Wherever we have a specific example that we can use of a particular individual or a particular event, we should be using it. Okay, so I'm going to show you my model answer and a student model answer in the feedback session, which will be in your next session. So this should take you 10 minutes on your own. Once you've finished, send me your work and I'll send you some feedback. Okay, have a lovely day and I will see you next time.